it's, now we're sitting here being told that master's programs aren't, necessary anymore, and we're being, all of us are being told to come up with a 10% cut. So I'd like to have a sense of what is behind this whole notion of the 10% cut. I do the math, and it looks to me like we're going to be cutting not just because we need the money, we're going to be cutting to do some sort of reallocation that is going to meet some kind of a purpose that nobody has been willing to come out and tell us what that purpose is. And I guess I would like to have the administration, if they have something in mind, and they have an overriding kind of framework in mind for their decision making, and they have a notion of what direction we're going to go in, I'd like to see what that direction is. I think it would be very helpful to just put all of the cards on the table. And I think it's important to have transparency. Budgeting, as you've all talked about, I think that's critical. But I think there's also got to be some sense of transparency in, underlying strategic planning that none of us seem to be privy to. So I don't know if any of you guys have any kind of insight into what that might be.
Well, I can speak to the 10% for some of the genesis that I wasn't in the actual meetings of the startup, but I'm on BPC. I don't know if anybody else is on BPC. I think the intent, and you can argue about whether the implementation will follow the intent or not, but the intent is to put in. If you look at BPC's initial discussion was, well, why don't we try for, like we usually do a 5 million, 10 million, 15 million, or 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, or pick your 3 scenario numbers and have people tell us what would happen if this much was cut, and then we decide to pick one of the scenarios or the other depending on what the assumptions are that we end up with and what budget gap results from those assumptions. I know that the President's Cabinet didn't want to do that again, so then the question was, well, let's just talk about program or elimination, not just academic program elimination, but eliminating big things or more strategically. So let's pick a number that's big enough so that if every unit said, this is what would happen if I eliminated 10%, then you could have the latitude of saying, all right, we don't need, the hope is we don't need to cut 10% from the overall budget, but we could take one unit and say, okay, you need to cut all of the 10% you suggested, all the way down to theoretically a unit that would say, well, what you've given us as 10% is not good stuff. We want to cut you 0%. So that's the theory, is to be able to provide that ability. Now the question will be, how does such a decision get made? That's a whole different story, and that's, I think, what you're talking about in terms of transparency, is when someone finally decides, okay, you're 10, you're 5, you're 0, what was the reasoning behind that decision, essentially, and that's usually made at the very top level. So that's where you need the transparency. But that's the reason for 10%. It's a totally arbitrary number, essentially. It's a big enough number. It's $35 million if you look at the Athens budget, to be big enough that you would eliminate large chunks of stuff when you went to eliminate something. But as we most know in academic units, 10% of an academic unit is a pretty big number. It's faculty. It means credit hour production. It means we drop off our ability to teach these students. So it's a much dangerous size number for an academic unit than, say, an academic support unit.
But that's not the way it was presented. And I think that's another problem. Not only do we need transparency, we need actual real communication, so people really understand the implications of what they're doing. So you're looking at doing a 10% cut on the one hand, and on the other hand, all you hear is program elimination. So people aren't looking at this as, oh, this is just a mind game we're playing. I think people need to know what it is we're doing and why we're doing this.
So the potential is out there in terms of, if you look at the structure of the budget. We know that there's a $10 million elimination of subsidy next year. Then it becomes a series of assumptions that can either make that be it or can make that be bigger. So then the next assumption is, are we allowed to increase tuition again next year like we did this year? Well, that's up to the trustees. They can say no, in which case that can't be used to help that $10 million. If we create certain inflationary assumptions of $10 million, doesn't assume any inflationary increases in budgets for raises and healthcare costs and utility costs and so forth. So put those assumptions in place, make the gap bigger. So it's back and forth. Then once the assumptions are set, then that creates a gap of a certain amount. So none of the other gaps have to exist, right? If you said, okay, we won't do raises, we won't do this, or we'll increase tuition, and from that amount of money we can make raises go this much, or if the trustees say you can't have the tuition increase, that means, okay, if we do raises, it means cutting budgets to get the money to do them and so forth. So those things have to trade off. You get to the gap that you want to tolerate in terms of cutting, and you have to look at this as a 2-year problem, because we have a $10 million cut from the state in next year. The following year, the state budget's built on an assumption of $15 million in federal stimulus money that's propping up the OU side of the appropriation. So if that's not replaced, the state revenue doesn't come back, or they decide to maybe put more money into higher ed so we don't have to cut it, but if that just disappears, you have an exposure for another $15 million there. So even if you would keep the gap small next year, then the question is, do you deal with the gap in the second year, or do you wait and do this all over again in the second year? And that gap can be increased or decreased depending on the raise decision in the second year and all those kinds of things. So it's many moving parts simultaneously coming up with it to an answer, basically.